I'm going to, some of you already know these people, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. And the first speaker will be Tanja Nathanael. She currently teaches children's literature and fantasy and science fiction for us. You may know her because she earned her BA from San Jose State in 2005 and her MA in 2010. But then she left us to go get her doctorate at the University of Southern Mississippi in 2019. And her dissertation was on borders, peripheries, and the idea of the North in 19th century British literature. She continues to research northern spaces and borders and peripheries in both 19th century British literature and contemporary international children's literature. She formerly served on the International Committee for the Children's Literature Association from 2015 to 2018 and continues to support its goals as a co-editor of the CHLA International Committee blog to encourage interest in international children's literature. And I'll put the website for that blog up in the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And in the meantime, here is Professor Nathanael.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm going to share my screen now. My share screen is disabled.
Oh,
so
okay.
Maybe you are going to have to share my.
Let me review that.
If that doesn't work, you can always share my PowerPoint like we originally planned. So yeah, whatever works, whatever's quickest or easiest.
See if I did it 2 different ways, so hopefully it'll work.
Okay. Select a window. Okay, so we want this one. Share. Okay, and then I can go slideshow. We go to slideshow. Oh, there we go. And begin. All right. Just getting used to the technical things here. All right, yay. All right, so now I can see my slideshow going. All right, so I was going to talk on using international children's books to challenge dominant narratives, cross boundaries, and build empathy. This is what we can use them for. You know, like I think this is the why. You know, like why do we need international children's books? And this is what we need them for, and this is how we can use them. So I'd like to start with a quote from scholar Ronald Jobe. He's quoted in Peter Hunt's International Companion Encyclopedia of Children's Literature, and I thought this was a really great way to start things off. He says, "Never has there been a greater demand to be able to read books from other areas of the world. Children need to read the best literature other countries have to offer. We must meet this challenge by respecting and providing the best in translations, or they will be cheated out of part of their global heritage." And I love that emphasis on global heritage, you know, like that's something that our children deserve, and, you know, and young readers and really all readers of children's literature can get this connection to a global heritage through these works. Now, the challenges that lie in place here, you know, that are the current state of the world of international children's literature, is that a very small amount of foreign children's literature currently gets translated into English, especially here in the United States, but this is true of like most Western English-speaking countries. The domination of foreign markets also by translations from Anglo-American children's books is also a factor. There's issues of multiculturalism and recognition of the global influence of children's books that's revealed by, for example, the unprecedented success of the Harry Potter series. And excuse me, this has led to questions about the principles that should govern such translations and about their cultural impact. And then the other notes that I have here are just basic translator challenges. So like whenever you encounter a translated book, you have to keep in mind that you are seeing the choices that the translator made in the process of translation. And this might be colored by their own biases, by their own understanding of what it means to write for children, and, you know, like whatever cultural values they're bringing to their translation. And then there's problems that arise in translation as well about character and place names, you know, how to translate those, intertextuality, slang, ideologies, political or sexual content, and so on. So all of these kind of like come into play when we're looking at books that have been translated from international cultures. Further problems or challenges that come into play, especially when we're looking at the American market, is how dominant the American market is in the children's literature publishing field. And we're sort of insulated in the United States, and so we're not really conscious of how much influence the American market has abroad, but it has a big influence. And we see very little internationally. So the statistics that are given here is that less than 1% of an estimated 300,000 new books translated published in English are books and translations from other countries. And sorry, my screen is hiding behind my thing here. I got to move it out of the way. More than 40% of that 1%. So this is 40% of that the estimated 300,000 books. 40% of that 1% of those books are from Western Europe. So we have almost no insight into what the rest of the world is reading. So one example also about like what we're actually seeing in the US, German books are the most translated abroad, according to UNESCO's Index Translationem. Authors like J.K. Rowling and Jojo Moyes will top both German and American bestseller lists, but it's rare for a German author to top the charts in the US. So we might see a J.K. Rowling, but we're not going to see a German author in the same way. Likewise, another interesting fact is that, for example, China, children's book publishing in China is up by 15% per year currently, but few US publishers are importing Chinese children's books. So what can we do about that? Well, we, the readers, have the power to change this trend simply by increasing the demand for international books. So, you know, asking for international books through our local bookstores and libraries, you know, ordering them, purchasing them as gifts, you know, as we enter into the holiday season. So, so we can do what we can to like push back at those trends. And so other things to keep in mind too is that in the importance of children's literature internationally is that every country has its own rich history of children's literature. It's not exclusive to you know, like Western or, you know, US, you know, English speaking countries. And by reading children's books in translation or books set in locations other than the US, readers begin to understand their peers in other countries, that they're very similar to them and their problems and expectations. And likewise, they get introduced to different cultures and perspectives that broaden their understanding of the world. So by reading more international books, introducing these books to others, we start to break apart single narratives or dominant narratives. And this is a popular TED Talk. I don't know, many of you might have heard of this already because it gets assigned a lot by teachers. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie calls the danger of the single story. Her single story TED Talk is really, really good. And by breaking up these narratives, by breaking up these dominant narratives, we can create a children's literature that's inclusive of diverse voices and international and multinational contexts. Okay, so one book I wanted to highlight as an example, something that I teach every semester in my children's lit class, is Traitor by Gudrun Posawong. And this is a German book. It's set in 1944 towards the end of World War II. And it considers Anna, who's about a 15-year-old young teen, and she's in Germany, and she discovers a Russian escaped soldier in her barn, and she decides to help him. You know, she decides to hide him and help him, even though it might mean that she could be executed as a traitor if she's caught. And what's interesting about this book is that the action of the book takes place in the Sudetenland. And this is an area of Germany that is on the border of Czechoslovakia. In fact, it used to belong to Czechoslovakia, but the Germans annexed it in 1938, and then of course occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. But what this border space, like this is what my research does and what I'm sort of fascinated with, this border space allows opportunity for Anna. It creates a space for her to be a little bit more mobile and a little, encounter, dangerous ideas. It's also a space where we can see that we're breaking apart that dominant narrative. I mean, it's very easy to think of Germany being inhabited by Germans. And yet in the Sudetenland, it's an area inhabited by Germans, Czechs, French, Gypsies, Poles, Ukrainians, and others. So we get this very diverse culture in this border territory. And so as, Anna, I call Anna a child of the border because her father was a traveling circus performer. So she was introduced to, alternative ideas through him. And he got to know Russians in their own country and he liked them. So she isn't quite convinced by Nazi propaganda that the Russians are these terrible, horrible monsters. And then also, she is more mobile because she is going to her high school in Schönberg. She has to leave her little village in Stiegnitz and travel by train. She goes to, walks to Melsdorf, catches the train, and spends the week in Schönberg. And this gives her, this mobility brings her into contact with more possibilities, more ideas. And we see we see this contrast, like Schönberg is the exciting place to her in the beginning. It's got the movies and plays and dance classes and, cafes, and Stiegnitz is like this boring little village. But from the reader's perspective, we can see that they're on the margins politically, and the people of Stiegnitz aren't as easily swayed by the propaganda as the rest of Germany is. So in Anna's moving back and forth, she comes across this, this little verse that reveals the existence of Dachau, the concentration camp. And she even asks a soldier on the train about it. She gets, is kind of emboldened to ask him about it. And he's like, don't ask, that's a question that could get you killed. Don't ask that question again. So we're coming up again against these dominant narratives, and how she has this character arc where she's learning to question what she's been told and resist the propaganda, and also learn empathy. She's learning to empathize with the German or the Russian soldier that she's helping. And in the end, Gudrun Posawong leaves her novel unresolved. She leaves the ending it's kind of a shocking ending and not quite satisfying, but it leaves it open for the readers to wrestle with those own questions of morality, just as Anna does, and consider how to maintain courage and, the courage of one's convictions in the face of impossible odds. And, so she questions if there really were German firing squads, German camps and trains, then the same atrocities were being committed on the German side as by the Russians. And so this is a realization that she makes in her growth towards understanding what's happening in her world at that time. Another book that I like to pair this with, there's a picture book called Memories of Survival, True Story by Esther Nisenthal-Krinitz. She was a young Polish girl. She was a Jewish girl, and she escaped from Nazi-occupied Poland around the same time that the novel is taking place. So those make a nice pairing, if you will. And I just wanted to mention that because it really is a beautiful book and it's worth taking a look at. So to conclude and kind of wrap up what I'm saying here, I wanted to end with a quote from Philip Nell, a couple of quotes. He says that boundary crossers remind us of how arbitrary those boundaries are. And I think that's a really important quote because, boundaries are imagined things. Like boundaries and borders are arbitrary, and books about crossing boundaries then brings these things into the forefront and draws them into question where we can talk about them. And then furthermore, Nell says, as scholars of children's literature, we can guide readers to books that harness the imagination's power to nourish empathy, and we can steer them away from those that reinforce bigotry. So careful, thoughtful readers can resist lies, misinformation, and scapegoating. So this is, again, like I thought I'd conclude with that idea of like, why do we need international children's literature? Because it's like we need to be able to talk about these dominant narratives, the negative dominant narratives that are shaping like some of these international contexts, and what push back at that and focus on empathy. So power of children's literature, especially international children's literature, is to like reinforce that empathy and inclusivity and diversity. There's all my references, and I can get those to you if you want more later. Thanks very much.
I was wondering, Tanja, if you deal much with border literature on the US-Mexico border.
I have not to date, but I'm really interested about that. Like if I could have done a dissertation on borders around the world, but that's like way too big. Maybe that will be a future book project or something, but I always thought it would be interesting to compare stories happening around the Mexico-US border with, say, the Berlin Wall or the Palestine-Israeli border. There's all kinds of walls and barriers in various situations around the world. The Great Wall of China, even, that create some interesting stories and would create some interesting narratives, and that bears looking into. But that's like one of those dream projects of mine. Like I don't know if this will ever happen, but it's in the back of my mind. It's something I want to do.
I'm teaching. I just finished teaching House on Mango Street in my grad course, because it's actually a course on short story cycles, but there's a lot of like young adult Bildungsroman type collections that are short story cycles. So we ended up dipping into a lot of kind of young adult fiction in the midst of, even though it's not my area, but in the midst of things. So I was just curious. One thing I can think of that kind of fits in that would be Elena Viramonte's oh my gosh, it's gone out of my head. Under the Feet of Jesus, which is about a girl that's in a migrant farm family. That kind of it seems to be.
I don't think I've heard of that one.
Certainly between kind of different, at least cultural borders. But also, like your piece reminded me of Markus Zusak's The Book Thief.
Yes. Yeah. I love Zusak's book. It's an amazing work, and I think it raises a lot of similar questions, but what I like about Traitor is that we're dealing with this very, as you could say, average teenage German girl, whereas Zusak's book is about a Jewish girl, and usually we see it from, through Jewish eyes, because they're the ones who are encountering, more strongly like the camps and the danger as much. But what I like about Traitor is that it kind of takes us into that narrative of like, well, what was the average German thinking when all this Nazi propaganda was going on? And it's very easy to blanket that over and say, well, they were all in on it, like they all knew about it, and or if they didn't know about it, they were still complicit because they were allowing the Nazis to do their thing, and this text kind of takes us into that environment and gives us something more to think about. It's like, yeah, there was a lot, there were a lot of people who were complicit, but there were also these people who were, really nervous, like they didn't like Hitler, but they were also scared for their lives. And, and how much courage it took to break the rules and just to be an empathetic human being, just to help someone
Right.
in distress. And I think it's a really important narrative to consider, especially in these times, because we have our own propaganda machine we have to deal with, you know, and how to maintain, again, that dignity and the courage of one's convictions to push back at the propaganda, you know, as well as dealing with, you know, just the mind-blowing idea that some people have that maybe the camps didn't actually happen or something like that. That's another reason why I like the book, is just like it, you know, treats it very normally, like, no, this is a fact, you know, like most people in the world know that this is something that occurred and that's a historical thing, you know. So there's just so much, there's so many elements of that book that make it a really important text. And then, like I said, that the ending it's a very violent ending. And it's, you know, and it leaves it wide open. Like, you do not know what happens to you don't know what happens to Anna at the end. You don't know what her fate is, because, you know, it's the war. It's the end of World War II, and the Russians are coming. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting text, and it leaves open for a lot of good discussion.
Excellent. I think in Zuzak, my favorite character is the Hitler Youth Jesse Owens fan. It just kind of gets at the complicated nature of childhood.
Yeah, of being able to hold those two disparate thoughts in the same brain and somehow still make it work.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Our next speaker, and if you guys have questions, we can do a whole lots of questions at the end. If you haven't thought of one yet, one might come up. Our next speaker is Professor Joshua Coleman. I think we're going to be calling him Josh Coleman here. He's a brand new assistant professor in English education. He is so new that even though he has an office and an office mate, he hasn't legally been able to share that office yet with an office mate, because he was hired, I think, just before he went into lockdown, and he arrived in the midst of the pandemic. So he's still our virtual professor, although he is in San Jose. He teaches children's literature, methods of teaching English, and writing in the young writer. He's committed to the study of multicultural children's literature. His research grounds itself in an anti-racist, justice-oriented framework that focuses on intersectional representations of queer and trans individuals, particularly in youth literature and media. He is published in Research in Diversity in Youth Literatures, Juness, Social Education, and Reading Research Quarterly. And he's excited to be here with you today. Hopefully there's more of you than are actually in his class already. So hopefully more of you will get to meet him. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It is sincerely my pleasure to be here with all of you. I found myself to be in a real wave of emotions over the last couple of days and spent a mostly sleepless night, but I'm honestly finding a lot of solace in seeing the wonderful names in this list. Many of you I already know, and thank you for being here to hear the little bit that I'm going to share today. And for those that I don't yet know, I just wanted to open an invitation to please reach out to me about anything that strikes you during the conversation. I'm incredibly excited to be here. Yes, I have not been to my office, though I have been told numerous times that it does indeed exist. Regardless, I am receiving email, so feel free to reach out to me for anything that might be of interest to you. And I'm going to very quickly share my screen. And okay, full screen. All right, and can everybody see that? Is that fine for folks? Okay, I'm seeing head nods, great. So Dr. Nathanael and I, when we were talking about sort of how to cohere together this talk and how our two perspectives, which really are quite different or that focus differently. So I have a very domestic focus. We were thinking, like, what is it that like values that lead us into this work? And one thing that we were really intrigued about was the notion of reading for resistance, right? How is it that we can use children's literature as a space for pushing the needle, for creating more just worlds? And so today, in sort of exploring that theme, I've organized my talk around three primary components of reading for resistance. The first is the what. So in order to know what we're resisting, we need to understand the histories that have given rise to our current climate in terms of children's literature, the current representational landscape. We need to know how. So I'm going to provide you some very concrete skills and places that you can go to start engaging reading as a form of resistance. And then much like Dr. Nathanael did, I'm going to end with the why. What is the importance here and why do we do this? And so to begin, I actually wanted to share a very selected and very limited timeline of multicultural children's literature, beginning in 1965 and moving through until today, into 2019 and 2020. In 1965, there was a landmark article published by Nancy Lyric entitled The All-White World of Children's Books. And this is taking place during the Civil Rights Movement. And it was a beginning moment in which people began to draw attention to the fact that in educational settings, in classrooms, children of color were not having access to books that reflected their own experiences in life. And so this was a pivotal article that began to propel educators and publishers alike to consider who it was that was being invited to write literature and then bring that literature into classrooms. And so I know it's a little blurry and hard to see, but underneath the picture, it reads, across the country, 6,340,000 non-white children are learning to read and to understand the American way of life in books which either omit them entirely or scarcely mention them. This was an article that sort of set off a whole spate of research over the course of the next 25 years. And it really culminated in another incredibly powerful article written in 1990 by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who you see featured here. And she wrote an article entitled Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Doors. And so if you've ever heard people refer to literature as a window into another experience or as a mirror into one's own experience, those were a series of metaphors that Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop put forward as a sort of litmus test for understanding who was having access to what representations, particularly in classrooms. And she was interested most specifically in the African-American community and in the fact that most Black children in America were not seeing themselves reflected in the literature that was invited into their classrooms. Jumping forward to 2018, this same metaphor is now being applied in a different context. It's being used as a way to understand the trends in the publishing industry as they exist today. And so what you see here is an infographic that uses data collected by the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And every year, a select number of books, publishers are invited to send a series of many books as they want, and they do an analysis of authors and representations. And you can see here the statistics really speak for themselves, indicating the representational landscapes, who it is that exists as primary characters in children's literature. And I think you can see that these numbers are dismal. They are shockingly actually better than they were just 3 years before. But regardless, I always like to point out that between white representation and animals or other, that constitutes a total of 77% of the available representation for children today. And I think realities like these, ones that are particularly focused on race and ethnic diversity, continue to drive the changes that occur. Nonetheless, we now exist in a world where intersectionality has become sort of the rule and litmus test of the day. So my question for you is, how did numbers like these shift when we began to think about relationships and representations of racial diversity in relationship with disability, with trans existence, with sexual orientation, with different religious orientations? And how is it that even nearly some 50 years later after Nancy Lyric originally wrote that article, we still are seeing numbers like these represented in the data? One of the spaces for that is certainly canonicity, and we can talk sort of a great deal later about what canon does as it trickles down often from the academy and into K-12 teaching spaces. But another place in which representations are fastidiously guarded in different contexts is through censorship challenges. So attempts by different individuals to limit the types of representations that appear in certain contexts, particularly in schools. Every year, the American Library Association, the ALA, creates a list of the top 10 most challenged books of that year, which they then put onto their incredible website and easily share for everyone. You can see here that most challenges take place at public libraries, This also occurs at school libraries, in schools themselves, in academia, and also in special and prison libraries. Today, however, I want to actually take a few minutes and look at the American Library Associations, and forgive me as I try to jump over to my other window. Let's see if I can do this with grace. Okay, great. So I think that you all now have access to the American Library Association webpage, and particularly to their Office of Intellectual Freedom, which tallies this data every year. And what's particularly useful is it gives a snapshot of what the top 10 books were for this year. And that's what we're about to watch a short video about. And so as I click for us to watch this video, I want you to go ahead and start trying to take some guesses. What are some books that you think were likely banned or that challenges were presented through this year? And what themes or trends might you expect to see? So I'm going to make this a little bit larger for everyone. And we're going to watch. All right. Thank you for humoring me and watching that entire thing. I think the point probably stands on its own. And I will say that this is a consistent trend. So here's a word cloud that sort of represents, in terms of scale, what the different reasons are that people are willing to write down on paper and say that books need to be removed from libraries. And I will say that the trend, particularly about LGBTQIA content, which, as you saw, 80% or 8 of the 10 books that were listed were explicitly attempted to be banned because they contained LGBTQIA content. This is a consistent trend. This isn't an outlying year. And in fact, every year I look to see, and Tango Makes Three was one of the last ones. It was written in 2004, and it's literally about 2 penguins based on a true story from a zoo in the Bronx, and it falls off the list every once in a while, but it's the little engine that could, and it finally came back after 2 or 3 years. So I'm always sort of perversely delighted to figure out when it's going to fall back on this list, because no one will let like these 2 little penguins just be. So anyways, all of this is to say, right, there's a very fraught sort of political landscape that circulates around children's literature. And it necessitates action. And one thing I like about the ALA is they give concrete steps and ways for combating challenges that folks don't agree with. And so I'm about to sort of shift, and I never thought I was going to be someone who advocated so intensely for digital media and online children's books. But it's something that I see as an incredible force for change. And it's one that I hope today I can provide you with some resources for taking some first steps or for diving in further. And so I'm moving now into the how part. How do we read for resistance? What are some mechanisms or tools that we can use to do that type of work? And the one thing that I can say is get engaged online. And I'm about to show you one particular hashtag that's currently doing a lot of work. And it's based on the statistic that you see here. Again, I know no one expected for an English professor to show this many sort of statistical like based types of things, but nonetheless, here we are. And this is from the same Cooperative Children's Book Center from the University of Wisconsin. And if you look at what I've put the orange box around, you'll see that there has been an increasing number of representations of Black and African children in children's literature. And you'll see that the number about is 452. The number by, meaning that the authors of those texts, of those representations, who also identify as Black and African, is 212. That means some 200 and, oh gosh, math, 40 rough people are not writing from their own experiences when they're sort of making these representations for children and young people. And we see this as an increasing trend. Something that was started in 2015, and this was by a young adult author out of Amsterdam, actually, who, after an important discussion, wanted to have a way for folks to recommend books in which kidlit about diverse characters that are also written by authors from the same diverse group gets increased recognition. And so the hashtag Own Voices movement is something that circulates particularly through Twitter, but is now used for marketing purposes for publishers. It's used for text selection for a number of teachers, and it's continuing to shape the landscape sort of in a hope that when you are an Own Voices text, it will be perhaps more culturally authentic. It will perhaps be less likely to be a misrepresentation. And so engaging in spaces like this is a great place to start. And so I wanted to sort of provide, and at the end of this, I'm going to provide you a link to an online document that myself and Dr. Nathanael have put together, where you can easily click on all of these recommendations that I've made throughout this talk. So no need to be like feverishly looking through your phones at the moment, unless you just want to. Know that's coming down the pike in just a few minutes. But three venues on Twitter that I would highly recommend for getting some of the basic sort of lay of the landscape and conversations that are going on in children's lit, particularly about diverse books. The first is @DiverseBooks, which is part of the We Need Diverse Books organization, which is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that is particularly invested in increasing diverse representations in the publishing industry. The next would be to follow hashtag Own Voices. So this is a great way to see new authors who might not have gotten the same amount of space. This is a wonderful location in which to sort of pierce through the prevalent sort of whiteness of a lot of children's literature and to see diverse authors having a space to like share their voice. And the third one that I would recommend is @Healing Fictions, which is run by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas at the University of Pennsylvania and puts forward daily recommendations for diverse children's literature in accordance with a monthly theme. So these are the places that I would say to start. Get on Twitter. And even though it might be uncomfortable, I promise, like once you get on there, there's a lot of great conversations. I'm not much of a tweeter myself, but I'm a lurker. And that helps me to stay sort of like up on what's going on and what people are talking about. There's always a scandal in children's literature. It never fails. So, you know, if for no other reason. This is a screenshot from the We Need Diverse Books blog. It really began as a blog and sort of translated into a little bit of a different context at this point, but their tagline is "Imagine a world in which all children can see themselves in the pages of a book." And they're not alone. There are actually a great number of incredible scholars who have a wonderful series of blogs that address different topics. So Build Your Stack, which is the second one, is from the National Council of Teachers of English. It's a grassroots movement to inform teachers, but also parents about different types of representations. They have collated blog entries that occur on nearly a weekly basis. There's the American Indians in Children's Literature, what's concerned with Native representation. There's Reading While White, to call attention to the ways in which white people often read text and unimagine diverse representation within it. There's Reading Spark, which looks at Asian American representation, disability in Kidlit, YA Pride, and Latinx in Kidlit, which is all available on the resource guide that, again, Dr. Nathanael and myself put together. And the last sort of recommendation I have about getting online is thinking about apps. So I really can't sing the praises of Epic quite enough, and I can give it sort of a personal stamp and an anecdotal approval in that my aunt, who is from Shanghai, wants to preserve and teach Mandarin to her child, and they live in rural Deep South. And they also don't have an influx of cash that would allow for them to buy many picture books consistently, and especially ones that can be more expensive, such as dual language books. She was able to get on here, sign up for a parent account, which is free for 30 days, and find and locate a number of dual language books that were written in both Mandarin and English. So it's really a great resource that really can sort of allow access. And for teachers, it's you can generate a free account, so to use with your young people, particularly if you're teaching the lower grades in elementary school. And then the second app that I'm recommending is Hoopla, which is actually about audiobooks. So it uses your library card, and then it allows you to stream a vast array of different literatures for young people. And so I really recommend this, particularly for students who might be a little bit more resistant or who just want to hear worlds come alive by having really exciting readers. So Epic and Hoopla are two spaces that I want to recommend if you're getting started online. And then my final bit is the why. Why should we be reading for resistance? And I just want to leave with one singular quote, which reads, if today's children grow up with literature that is multicultural, diverse, and decolonized, we can begin the work of healing our nation and world through humanizing stories. And so nothing is a panacea. Online works are not a panacea, but is a start. And it is a way to touch the minds of our youngest learners, the hearts of our youngest learners. And I think it's a powerful vehicle for shaping a future that is more just. And with that, oh no, you can do it. Final slide. Okay, so to help with the transition, so Dr. Nathanael and myself, we're gonna sort of just open up, not to questions, but also to provide you all with links to the resource guide. So if you have a phone and you wanna be kind of tech savvy, you can actually hold up the camera feature to the, just like I'm doing right now, and a drop down will fall, and it should open to the Google Doc that says Children's Literature Resources. So that's what I'm seeing on my shining phone. You can also, however, type in where it says tinyurl.com/SJSU Kidlit Mixer 20. If you put that, and I can copy and paste this and put that into our chat to make it a little bit more streamlined, that will get you immediately into that document for sort of the remainder of our talk. But that's all that I have to share with you right now. I know that was sort of a whirlwind approach to sort of the domestic landscape of children's literature, but I'm incredibly excited to talk with you all and to sort of dialogue together.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. It's always awkward to clap on Zoom, but wherever you are, please do so. One of the things that came up when you were talking about own voices hashtag, it made me think I think it was yesterday or today, I was scrolling through my Prime Video on Amazon feed, sure. And it had a line that was like, oh, Native American Voices Month. And one of the movies that they were recommending was The Education of Little Tree.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if you've heard of this, but The Education of Little Tree is a book that came out in the 70s, and it was supposed to be about a young boy growing up with his Cherokee grandparents in the Appalachians. And it was supposed to be an authentic memoir. And it ended up being, it was actually written by this KKK member from Alabama. And it was basically just, completely fiction, just sure. Whole cloth based on his own imagining of what a Cherokee childhood would have been like. And yet, there it was on my 2020 Prime Video feed is like Native American Voices Month, and I don't know when I didn't even know a movie had been made from it. I thought it was a big seller when it came out, but I thought it'd been pretty well discredited. But evidently, it was the guy from Babe, Cromwell was in it. So it must have been, somewhere in the last 15 years, I guess it was done. I don't know. But that really shocked me. But just, you know,
Right.
that sense of like, not only there are few representations, but it's not always self-representation. People aren't always, you know, people within the community are not always in control of how it's depicted,
Mhm.
can be pretty shocking.
Yeah, I know. I always look and I'm always ready for these statistics to like, like dramatically, drastically change. And we're seeing instead really sort of incremental changes in children's literature with what we're seeing. And it really is a brand new trend to see such a huge gap in the fact that like there are more representations, particularly of Black girlhood and Black girls. But so many of those are not written by Black women or Black girls. And so, you know, it's not to say that people can't write across these, thinking about borders, like you were talking about, Dr. Nathaniel. You know, like it's not to say that people can't write outside of their own experiences, but it's saying that that takes a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of intention and a lot of time. And I
Mhm.
know personally, knowing a good deal of young adult literate like authors, for example, the pressure to pump out 2 massive novels in a single year just to keep bread on the table is really, you know, prescient for a lot of them, or
Mhm.
pressing for a lot of them. And so I think these sorts of hashtags are really important for doing work to call attention and hopefully to open up space in publishing industries that haven't always been as open to sort of different representations across time. So, you know, good movement is happening, but I think we all just are sort of like waiting with bated breath. Um, you know, and I think a lot about American Dirt, if you all are familiar with that sort of big sort of controversy that came out. And more recently, we've had, you know, 2 or 3 academics who were claiming that they were a racial or ethnic minority and then come to find out that they're not. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of really complicated questions invited by this type of like Twitter, you know, sphere. And again, I just repeat, I'm not actually a huge Twitter person. I find it very useful, but I also have to like very intentionally limit the amount of access I have because otherwise my anxiety like goes through the roof. So I
Yeah,
say,
I want to piggyback on the back of that because it's like your Twitter feed will be much happier if you put more children's lit authors in
yes.
it. Like
Mhm.
I follow artists and, you know, like children's lit book writers and like all of this children's lit stuff. So I have a very happy Twitter feed. I don't, you know, like I don't have any depression happening there.
Yeah, I learned the term doom scrolling yesterday, which I was like, oh, that really, you know, that really encapsulates it. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, so that's what I had to share.
You mentioned scandals, and of course,
Mm.
we always want to hear those.
Oh, yeah.
Um, one thing that I can offer from my own experience, I'm actually teaching next week. I'm teaching Lois and Yamanaka's Wild Meat and the Bully Burgers,
Uh-huh.
which is a kind of it's a short story cycle sequence, short story sequel sequence again, and it's somewhat of a bildungsroman, and it's set in on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Okay.
And the author actually utilizes Hawaiian Creole English, so she's really trying to, you know, give you a sense of, you know, the authentic language of local culture in Hawaii.
Mhm.
But Yamanaka herself became very controversial in the late '90s because she came out with another book, um, Blues Hanging, that depicted, I mean, all of her, because they're set in Hawaii, they're all predominantly Asian American characters,
Mhm.
Pacific Islanders and so on. But she has a like a Filipino pedophile in that in that um, in that novel. And basically, in the late '90s, I think it was around like '98 or so, '97. Um, anything that the Association of Asian American Literature gave a prize to, the Hawaiian schools would basically put on their you know, on their curriculum. And so they did it with Blues Hanging, and then there was this huge uproar, and like a lot of people within the Asian American Studies Association actually protested that her book got this award because they felt that her, even though she herself is a Japanese American, they
Mhm.
felt like her depiction of Filipino Americans was so
Mhm.
stereotypical and negative.
Right.
And because the power of that award, I mean, and actually I don't think the academics actually gave the award realized that there was this kind of automatic pipeline into the public schools, but like you mentioned, like the way ethnicity kind of trickles down. In Hawaii, that was a very real connection between this award and the curriculum. She hasn't really written a huge amount since then. I mean, she written a couple books came out since then, but in the last 15 years, nothing. So I'm just wondering what other, obviously we want to hear about other scandals, but what kind of impact do some of these books have?
The ones that do become controversial?
Yeah.
For example, oh gosh, I'm trying to think about specific examples. Okay, so I think one that comes to mind is Sherman Alexie's The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian.
Right.
That one has been, it is one of the most commonly taught books, I would say, especially depicting like Native youth, for example, across the country. And I think you can find it in most book rooms. It certainly existed in the high school that I taught in North Carolina. And he was indicted by numerous Native women during the Me Too movement that was sort of surging. And Native scholars, particularly Debbie Reese, who runs the American Indian in Children's Literature blog, was just adamant that we need to not be teaching this man, frankly, that his personal politics were so fraught. And also people really sort of push back on that book. It's well loved and it really is quite clever. And I know why young people like it, but it sort of has the message of like, get off of the res. That's the way that you're going to succeed in life. And so there are so many books that don't fall into that narrative, but also his personal politics came into play in a way that people have sort of pushed to get him out of K-12 classrooms. And so that's a big thing that I talk about in my children's literature class, actually, because how do we take into it? Can we separate art from the artist?
I talk about that too.
Yeah, I don't know. Have you talked about the J.K. Rowling scandal at all, Dr. Nathanael?
Yes.
That's been...
Yeah, I actually added, so the way I have my classroom set up is that I've got the mainline assignments, like the essay and the group project and the final assignment. And then I've got like these little side quests, I call them, where they can do, it's tied into their class participation. Essentially, they do this, and as long as they keep, like do a regular amount of these things. And so I created, like, I assigned them to read about the controversy. Like I had them read the essays, but if you want to respond to it, then you can go to this little side thing and you can start a conversation. And so I raised the question, and it's a question that will come up again and again. Like, how do we separate, or can we separate the art, the author from the work? Like, does a work take on its own life, become its own entity, separate from the author? And can we, can we keep that in balance? Or is it a case of cancel culture? Like if, we're so offended by something that an author or artist does, do we need to ban their book? Yeah. And it's a controversial thing. Like, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about all of that, because I don't believe in banning books, but at the same time, it's like I can understand how something that an author might say would be, personally offensive or whatever. So it's gotten some very good, like I thought I got some very thoughtful responses from the students who chose to participate in that conversation and respond to, I asked them not to respond whether or not they agreed with Rowling, but I wanted them to engage with this idea itself of, is it possible to, separate a work from the author and just enjoy it as its own creation,
Yeah. For those who may not know, J.K. Rowling has really doubled down on Twitter, again, everybody's favorite platform, and has really said some incredibly transphobic things, and not just once, but numerous times, and just sort of keeps doubling down. And there's been a huge backlash from the trans community. And many people have been calling for her to be canceled, right? So there's the idea of cancel culture. And just like you were saying, we talk about that a great amount, actually. Do we call in? Do we call out? Do we cancel? Right? What do you think? And how does this inform the text that then you choose to put in front of your students? Right? It's, I also, vacillate sort of in my feelings in a lot of ways, because I mean, especially when a text like Harry Potter is so wrapped up in nostalgia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right? it meant a great deal to me in childhood, but I also know that it's the platform that she uses to propel her ideas actively creates an environment that is hostile and dangerous for trans people. So how do I hold those two things together in the decisions that I make? You know, I think it's hyper complicated, and I think it's just as complicated for all of the teachers who are going into classrooms every day.
I think I'm kind of fascinated with the idea of what we do with living versus dead authors. It's almost like we can handle the dead authors a little bit better, even if they're far, far more, you know, racist or bigoted in their views. So in my science fiction class, they're going to be engaging with this soon, if not this week, then next week. But Lovecraft is very problematic. And I have them read an essay by Nydia Okorafor where she challenges her own feelings about Lovecraft because she won the World Fantasy Award, which is basically the bust of Lovecraft. And she did not realize how, I mean, she'd heard that he was a little racist, but she didn't realize how racist. And so she had this up on her mantle because she was proud. Like, she was the first African American woman to win the World Fantasy Award. So she was very proud of that. And a friend of hers came over and said, "What is that man doing on your mantle?" You know, like, no. So she started researching it. And anyway, it's a very short, concise blog entry. And she comes to the conclusion that she will turn his face to the wall. And she absolutely acknowledged, but she doesn't believe in, she said, like, we should not ban these books, but what we need to do is engage with them. It's like, we need to engage, like, we need to bring this out into the light and we need to talk about it. And so this whole idea of conversation, that we can't hide from it, we need to talk about what this racism means in this field of literature. And, you know, like, make make sure that conversation moves forward, because by banning it, it's just sweeping it under the rug again.
I appreciate that.
Is there anything else you guys want to ask? Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. It was really nice not to think about election results or anything else for an hour. And it was lovely talking to you guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to our talk, everyone.